And welcome to the October LINKOnline seminar. I'm Nicolette, Marketing and Brand Manager for Manaaki Whenua, filling in for Christine Harper. One of the really fun parts of my job is sharing our research and seeing how it's making an impact. Today, we are celebrating the final stages of a 5-year program reducing nitrogen losses from farms. It's hard to tell the whole story in just 20 minutes, but David, Scott and Harini will do their best. We will share additional links and resources on the email following this presentation. David Whitehead is a principal scientist for climate smart agriculture at Manaaki Whenua and has been leading research in measuring and modelling greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture ecosystems in relation to climate change. Scott Graham, also Manaaki Whenua, works at the interface of hydrology, ecology, soil science to explore the impacts of irrigated systems. Professor Harini Matunga brings a wealth of Māori environmental policy and planning expertise to the project, creating a multi-order systems framework which has used as a blueprint to link experimental research with decisions that acknowledge the benefits of utilising Motoranga Māori, meeting cultural expectations to sustain relationships with Te Taio. I'll be back at the end to help with questions. Don't forget to put your questions in the chat box as soon as you can. Take it away, David.
Kia ora, good morning. Welcome to this webinar. We'd like to use this opportunity to highlight the research we've been doing over the last 5 years as a large MBIE program, Endeavour program, that has recently finished to help farmers provide farmers with solutions to reducing nitrogen losses from farms. But we realized rapidly that we can't just look at nitrogen by itself. There are strong interactions with carbon. And the result is there's always trade-off effects in nitrogen and carbon. We want to reduce nitrogen but maintain soil carbon. So we'll be telling you about what we've done. We'll be telling you about the trade-off effects this morning. This program was a large program. It was led by Manaaki Whenua, but collaborators include Lincoln University Plant and Food Research, Scion, University of Canterbury, AgResearch, and the New Zealand Greenhouse Gas Agricultural Research Centre. Please allow me to explain some of the background for the context for the work that we did. And I'm taking this from the most recent report of the State of the Environment for New Zealand, Our Land 2021. A large area of New Zealand is in exotic grazed grassland, 40%, and the numbers of animals cattle have increased dramatically in the last 40 years. They're now up to 6 million. They, of course, are a major contributor to the primary industries and to the export earnings of New Zealand, and that is anticipated to increase over the next decade. This has all been possible because of the large conversion of irrigated land, which was previously in dry land. Now, particularly 5% of New Zealand land area is irrigated, and 58% of that is used for dairy farming, which has been doubling over the last 20 years. But a lot of that area is in Canterbury. 64% of that area is in Canterbury. Now, on the right-hand side of this slide at the top, that shows the numbers of increasing in animals over the last 50 years, and it's very clear that the number of dairy cattle has increased dramatically, whereas beef cattle and sheep have tended to decline over that period. And associated with that is also the increase in fertilizer use. On the bottom side, the right-hand side shows the increase in nitrogen use as urea in the blue line, and phosphorus and potassium in the brown and the green lines, which have not increased in anything as a result. So while this has been highly successful and highly productive in terms of dairy farming in New Zealand, a lot of it is on dry land area conversions, which are on shallow stony soils, particularly in Canterbury, and that's why the focus of our work was in Canterbury on these soils. Production is successful, but there is increasing intensification leading to losses of soil carbon, leaching of nitrogen, whereas we need to increase soil carbon in order to improve the sustainability, the productivity, but also increase the resilience of systems to extreme climate events, and also help to mitigate climate change by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it into the soil. And in terms of nitrogen, leaching degrades drinking water and freshwater ecosystems. There are concerns about that. So our program set out to look at this, and we focused on Canterbury, and this is a a photograph of the Canterbury Plains with Lake Whenua in the in the bottom of the photograph. This is taken from our land report, and the number of irrigation systems associated with dairy farming is clear from this diagram. The red dots are all pivot irrigators, the yellow ones are rotor irrigator systems, and the green ones are lateral irrigation systems. But of more concern is the green color of the lake, which is attributable to algal growth, which is due to the large amount of fertilizer that's been entering the lake over the last 20 years in particular. So there's a clear concern about that, and that's what our research was based. So we looked at systems where they transfer from dryland on the left-hand side of this photograph, dryland sheep farming, through to dairy farming in the center, and what the impacts were on intensive grazing shown on the right-hand side of this figure. Now, our approach was to look at and quantify the inputs and losses of carbon and nitrogen to these systems and test management practices where we could improve the practices in terms of reducing nitrogen losses. But we also ran a plural knowledge approach, which combined our experimental research with collaboration in Mataronga Maori theme. And I'd like now to pass over to Hirani to explain about the developments that he has been doing in the Mataronga Maori theme. Kia ora, Hirani.
Kia ora, David. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi kia koutou, no mai haere mai. Yeah, pleased to be able to discuss our research with you this morning. Really, as David's outlined, you know, big problem requiring quite innovative solutions, and in a way, this is where this concept of plural knowledges has come in, and it's science alone is not going to be able to solve these problems. What is required is what we call a plural knowledges approach, and that's really the approach that we've taken throughout our research. And I suppose one of my critical functions has been ensuring that we delve into Mātauranga Māori, but we also try to shape up a Mātauranga Māori informed approach to improving environmental quality, and as we know, in production contexts, but not only that, consistent with the exercise of kaitiakitanga. So for that, we do need to engage with tangata whenua, mana whenua, kaitiaki. It's kaitiaki that do kaitiakitanga. So that's what's really driven our contribution and theme in this research. And we've consciously taken what we call a plural knowledges approach. And this plural knowledges approach is really around collaboration. This is collaboration across knowledge systems, not integration. Okay, so looking at the value that Mātauranga Māori can add to this big problem, along with science, but also other knowledges, including community knowledge. It's important to acknowledge in this context not only the legitimacy, the coherence, but also the integrity of Mātauranga Māori. This is not a case of cutting, splicing, dicing different knowledge systems and ending up with a mishmash. This is about collaboration across knowledge systems, acknowledging the coherence and the integrity of those knowledges. But how do we get them actually working together? Next slide, David. Now you might say, well, okay, yeah, great idea, but how on earth do you do it? And so what we've had to do is really look at a framework that I developed many years ago, actually, working with iwi and hapu around the country. And what I had noticed, not surprisingly, is that the primary driver of Māori environmental decision making, and indeed planning, was around enhancing the mauri, or the life essence of our taonga, our resources, our lakes, rivers, streams, and indeed our mahinga kai. So if we're going to take this notion of plural knowledges we've got to understand how it might function within a Mātauranga Māori or Te Ao Māori context. So the framework that we have is grounded in Te Ao Māori. And what it does is it really looks at it tries to better understand the interaction between taonga, kaitiaki and tikanga, and how together they impact on regenerating the mode of our resources. So in a way, this is a decision-making evaluation framework grounded in Te Ao Māori, tikanga Māori. The focus, as you can see in that diagram, is on protecting, maintaining, and indeed enhancing the mode of our taonga across a broader ecosystem catchment area. Some of you might be familiar with quite unique Māori concepts and approaches. Kiutiki Tai is a good example. And what that does is that emphasizes interconnection between taonga. So we have a river, for instance. What happens upstream in that river will have a downstream impact. That downstream impact will eventually have an impact on the coastal marine area. How do these all connect together? We can't look at this in a private property context because property boundaries don't exist in nature. They're human constructions. So what we've got to do is we've got to look at this within the context of ecosystems, catchments. So the framework that we've identified on the right is essentially about taking a proposition, and the proposition might be a farmer might want to intensify their dairy herd. Okay, that is the take. If we run it through the system, what we then have to ask ourselves is, what are the taonga potentially impacted by that? Who are the kaitiaki? What tikanga will kaitiaki use to make a decision around impact, cause and effect? All of this will be driving to retaining and indeed enhancing the mode, life essence, or the regenerative capacity of our resources. One of the things we've really noticed, well, not surprisingly actually, one of the things we've noticed in our research to date is the importance of mahinga kai, or food gathering areas, as really critical indicators of ecosystem health. So they're a really important guide to the state of our, not only our ecosystem health, but clearly the mode of those resources. And David pointed out in that first slide, Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora, amazing mahinga kai in Canterbury, absolutely critical that that is protected and enhanced. Next slide, David. Okay, so what we've needed is we've needed to shape up, not only have an analysis of the problem that has already been articulated, a framework for trying to deal with it, which is the mode order framework, but we've then got to ask ourselves, how do we apply that in a multiple plural knowledge context? So it's been a really important part of the research. Now, if you follow this diagram, it's a paired back diagram of a process that can be used to apply this plural knowledge approach. Okay, so you have a farmer. Let's say there's a farm proposition, might be an existing farm, might be a proposed new farm. Scale of operation might be extending out, might be close to a mahinga kai, such as Te Waihora. What do you do? Okay, where do you start? If we plug that into this plural knowledge approach, clearly there needs to be engagement with mana whenua, tangata whenua, iwi, hapu whānau, and their kaitiaki. There might be other Māori entities, but really what we're doing is we're spatialising the problem, spatialising the issue, and in that spatialising process, we clearly identify iwi and hapu and whānau are concerned that have a vested interest in this proposition. Okay, now that we have that, mana whenua also will have their own frameworks, and we've posited this framework called called the Modi Water Systems Framework that they can apply in this context to suit their context. They might vary the framework. What they'll be looking at is the impact of the proposition on their mahinga kai. Okay, so there are various tools that we can use: cultural mapping, Modi impact assessment. There are a range of tools that can be applied. Clearly, in a plural knowledge framework, there will be other knowledge inputs, including science that Scott's going to be talking about. And then what we're doing here is we're setting up a framework for collaborative thinking and a collaborative response. And it's that we can then take back to the farmer. And, you know, we really set up a mechanism for contact, possible mediation and negotiation, driving towards that end goal of reducing farm nitrogen loss. So folks, really what I've taken quite quickly through is the problem, a framework to actually look at the problem, a method for applying, taking that framework and applying it within a plural knowledge context that is spatialized to the particular issue area, etc. Scott, over to you.
Oh, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'd just like to summarize some of the research findings of our larger project team, particularly focusing on the work we did at the Ashley Dene Research and Development Station. That's a Lincoln University research farm, and it was really a great platform for looking at nitrogen losses from farms, in that Ashley Dene was converted from a dryland sheep and beef farm in 2015 to an irrigated intensive dairy farm. And that's really typical of this conversion that David talked about in the beginning, which is happening across Canterbury. And similar to other Canterbury farms, this is occurring on the stony soils, which we know are prone to nitrogen losses. All right, next slide, please, David. Yep, so the larger concept of our project is that if we could increase carbon inputs to the soil, we could reduce nitrogen losses. And one way to modify carbon inputs to the system is to change the forage species that we're using, or mix of species. And our colleague William Talbot, who was a PhD student at Lincoln University, along with his advisor Keith Cameron, set up this array of well-replicated lysimeters, lysimeters being these enclosed columns of soil which we can use to collect drainage and measure leaching losses. He used these lysimeters to investigate different sward compositions and also urine compositions and added carbon and the effect on nitrogen leaching. Next slide, please, David. The key findings of this work were really the benefit of incorporating Italian ryegrass and plantain into swards to reduce nitrogen leaching losses. And this really depends on the ability of the known effect of plantain to reduce urine nitrogen concentration and thereby reduce nitrogen leaching, and as well the incorporating the winter activity of species like Italian ryegrass, which increases winter uptake of nitrogen during that winter rainy season when drainage is occurring and leaching losses occur. As well, William found that fodder beet urine has a particular effect of reducing urine from cows fed on fodder beet has a particular effect of reducing nitrogen leaching losses through this potential biological nitrification inhibition effect. He also demonstrated that applying a readily available carbon source to the soil decreases nitrogen leaching without increasing nitrous oxide emissions. Next slide, please, David. So that was a lot of really great plot scale work that William did. But in looking at nitrogen losses from farm management, we really want to make measurements at the scale at which these managements are applied, and that being the paddock scale. So our group here at Manaaki Whenua really specializes in these paddock scale techniques, and in particular the eddy covariance technique, the system here on the right, which measures the net CO2 exchange between the atmosphere and plants and soil. As well, in the bottom left corner, you see and in the center of this photo, you see our large lysimeter sites for measuring nitrogen leaching losses, as well as carbon and phosphorus leaching losses. And we can use these two measurements in combination of measurements of exports of carbon and nitrogen from the system from harvest and grazing, as well as measurements of other inputs to the system from effluent addition or grazing animal inputs to the system. We can use all this to compile a carbon or nitrogen balance for the system. Now we took our instruments to Ashley Dean and deployed them in two areas of the farm, a non-irrigated area and an area irrigated with water and effluent. And both sites were planted in lucerne, lucerne being a valuable forage crop, and as well having deep roots which could potentially intercept nitrogen at depth and increase carbon inputs to the soil. But what we found is that if you look at this figure, what this shows is the cumulative carbon balance of the system over 4 years of measurement. And what you see is that as the lucerne starts to grow, the carbon balance becomes positive, meaning the system is gaining carbon. But then when you harvest the lucerne, you take it off the site, it's exported. And so the line drops off steeply back towards zero. And as you go through this repeated harvest cycle, what you see is that typically at the end of the season, the cumulative carbon balance is dropping below zero, meaning the system is losing carbon. And what we find is that on average, the irrigated site loses more carbon than the non-irrigated site. So this really goes against this strong perception that irrigation increases carbon inputs to soils. They're actually losing carbon. As well, what you see is that our non-irrigated site can actually gain carbon in some years in that third year of measurement, and that's related to a shift from a cut and carry system, which exports all carbon, to a grazing system where a portion of that carbon is left behind. All right, but what does this mean for nitrogen? So next slide, please. Well, similar to carbon, what we found, these are again cumulative plots of nitrogen leaching over the 4 years. And what we found is that similar to carbon, irrigation increased the nitrogen loss of the system. We also saw a large variability in nitrogen losses, particularly from our irrigated system. And that has a lot to do with timing of drainage, in particular, irrigation season drainage events. So summertime drainage events carry particularly large nitrogen losses. And as well, as we saw that shift from cut and carry to grazing, we saw an increase, a 3 times greater nitrogen loss. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we irrigate, we know that we can grow more lucerne, so we get a production benefit. But there's this trade-off in that if we irrigate, instead of losing plus or minus 1 ton of carbon per year from non-irrigated lucerne, we find ourselves losing 2 to 3 tons of carbon from the soil per year. We can find that grazing can lead to net carbon gain, particularly with high rates of supplementation, since the animals are leaving behind carbon. But again, with nitrogen leaching, where we're losing 7 to 9 kilos of nitrogen under non-irrigated cut and carry lucerne, we're losing 3 times greater amounts when you shift to grazing. As well, losses under irrigation are much higher. And as a result of these greater inputs from the irrigated system, we find that similar to carbon, these soils are probably losing nitrogen. So the recommendation being that lucerne is not going to be an effective mitigation strategy for soil carbon or nitrogen leaching. We have this grazing, cutting management trade-off. One potential benefit to both the carbon and nitrogen balance would be deficit irrigation, particularly late in the season, to minimize drainage during the winter, at the start of the winter drainage season, and potentially prevent carbon losses. And we're exploring these trade-offs more with farm scale modeling. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you, Hirini. Thank you, Scott. Just the last point then, I wanted to say thank you so much for the 31 people who contributed to this massive research program over 5 years. Clearly, a lot of people were involved in that. We can't possibly present all of the findings, and so those links there show you where you can go for more information at our website and presentation of our findings we had for a workshop. We also acknowledge the 3 PhD students who graduated as a result of this project and the work that they did. And that we continue to engage to translate our data and our plural knowledge approaches for end users. And we have set the pathway for continued engagement with Tangata Whenua. Thank you.
And thank you, David, Hirini, and Scott for presenting today. It's a huge amount of research that's been done over the past 5 years with some really interesting results. So I hope everyone you've enjoyed the questions today. I've just got one small question come through, just to clarify something for you, David. Was it a fertilizer or a mix of fertilizer and urine nitrogen runoff that was causing the algal blooms in Lake Te Waihora?
We're not responsible for those measurements. That's done by MFE, and so I just refer you to the report. The observation is that clearly nutrients are running off into the site, but the origin of those nutrients is a catchment scale question, which our research is not able to address directly where it came from.
Okay, that's fine. And if anyone else has any additional questions, they can continue to ask in the question box, and we will answer any questions that come through and send it through to you directly. We also have some additional resources coming your way, a summary video of the project, some workshop presentations, and additional links to our website where we've got regular updates that's on this research project. So watch out for this. And thank you very much for tuning in today, and watch out for the next LINKOnline webinar. Will be coming to your inbox soon. So thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.